welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring contribution and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. So, less depressing intro than last time, although maybe not. I had a pretty low-key July 4th long weekend thing. We're dog-sitting for a greyhound who's freaked out by fireworks and thunder, so we kind of had to comfort that guy for a chunk of the weekend, or at least watch him pace around and kind of whine in the house and clean up the little drippy from his nose and all that stuff. That's greyhound anxiety. I also recorded this week's episode, and an old college pal of mine and past pod guest, Ian Kelly, came by for an overnight visit. We talked a bunch, had a long hike at Sterling Forest State Park. I otherwise avoided doing any running or aggravating the ITB issue I've got. I'm hoping to get running again later this week, but we'll see. Now, this weekend, I'll be in Massachusetts for ReaderCon, an annual literary, fantasy, and science fiction conference. I was just, corresponding with one of my ReaderCon sort of pals, and I noted that I go to ReaderCon adjacent. I don't actually go to the sessions or the parties or any of the real content side of, and it's a wonderful show. I just don't tend to go to the programming. I tend to end up recording podcasts with some of the guests, hanging with some of my old pals in the evenings, going out to dinner with an old college pal who lives near there, schmoozing with writers and other people over breakfast, and generally just, being my art barnacle that I am. I do get to go to the book dealer's room, though, and I tend to come away with something while I'm there. That's always a blast. I do not have a show ready for next week yet, but if I have time, I'll edit one of my ReaderCon sessions and post that next Tuesday. Otherwise, that'll be the week off that I've been threatening to take. I was going to take this week off, but I enjoyed the conversation so much this weekend, I figure I just have to share it with you guys as soon as I can. My guest this time around is Emily Nussbaum. Emily is the television critic for The New Yorker, and her first book just came out, and it's called I Like to Watch, Arguing My Way Through the TV Revolution, from Penguin Random House. It collects some of her reviews from The New Yorker, as well as New York Magazine, and I think Slate, as well as her profiles of several TV showrunners, and features a couple of new essays. Now, in the true spirit of the binge era of TV, I managed to read I Like to Watch in the span of 2 days. I just devoured this book the way you would eat up a new season of Stranger Things or whatever. Emily's writing is just delightful in and of itself. Her criticism, though, it gets at the heart of what works and what doesn't work and why for shows of all different genres. And she's wonderfully generous in her taste. She's no snob about particular types of programming, but she's really good at, again, what works, what doesn't, and what the neat little aspects of how shows get made comes together. The profiles that I mentioned are also really revealing in terms of their subjects, in this case, Kenya Barris, Genji Cohen, and Ryan Murphy. But they also kind of help the reader see how the sausage gets made in the interplay between those creators and showrunners, studios, networks, actors, crew, and the other producers. Those things are really illuminating when you get to see the personalities of those particular creators and how that intersects with the TV we end up seeing. The whole book is just an absolute joy for me to read, even if, as I mentioned during the beginning of the conversation, I've watched almost none of the shows that Emily includes in the reviews that are in the collection. She's reviewed a great deal more than that, but it just happens that of everything she reviews in there, pretty much the only things I've seen are The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, The Americans, True Detective, and maybe one or two others. Regardless, I think I Like to Watch is an important work because it brings historical perspective to this era where TV became peak TV, or prestige TV became peak TV, and then it all accelerated past anyone's ability to watch and assess it all. Emily will characterize her arguments about TV near the beginning of the episode, but one of the key aspects of it and of this book is a celebration and appreciation of TV as TV, not, well, it's really more like a novel, or it's more like a 10-hour movie, which was sort of admirable in the early aughts when people were trying to again, attach some frame of reference to something like The Wire. But ultimately, The Wire is really a police procedural TV show that just grows in scope and does a lot more than TV used to be able to do. Anyway, we don't talk about The Wire in this episode. And in fact, in her book, outside of The Sopranos, a lot of those canonical shows she doesn't run the reviews for those because they've been treated a lot, and she kind of finds some other gems and other things that help make her argument. Altogether, this is not just a rah-rah, go team TV book. She includes some of her negative pieces, and there are also a few essays, both collected, previously published, and new, that get at other aspects of our fame-driven culture, using TV as a springboard, but still. One previously published one works on how you deal with the just a joke, lighten up culture around deadly serious language that led to the current occupant of the White House. The longest piece in the book, though, Confessions of a Human Shield, is this really intricate and lacerating and self-lacerating exploration of how we deal with art by terrible people, usually men, in the Me Too era. It centers around work by Woody Allen, Roman Polanski, and Louis C.K., but ultimately brings in that entire debate as to how do you approach art by terrible people. It's a must-read. Confessions of a Human Shield is worth the price of the book, so I hope you all pick up I Like to Watch immediately after you finish listening to this show. Now, as caveats go, there's this weird flutter that occurred on Emily's channel a few times. Sorry, I didn't notice it when I was doing the initial testing. It only comes and goes a few times during the show. Also, her dog Bella needed some attention at a few points, so there were a couple of breaks. Most of them I sew together so you don't really notice it, but about 28 minutes in, we took Bella out for walkies and kind of thread our way back to the conversation. It takes a little while, and I'll note when that happens so you understand why there's this weird split. The other thing is, we talk primarily about the book and about TV, and not much about Emily's life or her writing upbringing or living in a two-writer household or her background in indie comics and the other more personal side of stuff. I pitched her on doing the podcast maybe 6 days before we recorded. I didn't think it'd be fair to dive into that sort of stuff without giving her sort of fair warning that that's where some of my conversations go, especially while she's still in the real publicity wave of the book, throwing her curveballs and, asking about her reading upbringing and all that might have been a little, distracting. Maybe we'll get into that stuff if we do a follow-up sometime, which I'm really hoping for. But this book is so rich, and the TV landscape that we live in offers so much to talk about, I figured we ought to stick with that. Now, here's Emily's bio. Emily Nussbaum is the television critic for The New Yorker magazine. She previously worked as an editor and a writer at New York Magazine, where she created The Approval Matrix. She's also written for Slate, The New York Times, Lingua Franca, and Nerve, among other publications. In 2016, she won the Pulitzer Prize for criticism. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband, Clive Thompson, and her 2 children. She doesn't have a favorite television show, but under pressure, she'll choose Slings and Arrows. Her first book is I Like to Watch, Arguing My Way Through the TV Revolution. And now, the Virtual Memories Conversation with Emily Nussbaum. Tell me about curating the collection. In addition to the new stuff, how did you pick and choose what goes in?
Well, it was both satisfying and horrifying experience, as always it is when you look back on your old work. But I knew some pieces that I wanted to have in the book. There are pieces that I feel like hold up, and there are also pieces that I felt went together with the argument I was trying to make, because I wasn't selecting just the pieces I liked the most. I was selecting pieces to try to make an argument about TV. So I knew the Sopranos piece was going to be there. I knew Sex and the City. I knew my piece on Norman Lear and The Bad Fan. And there were ones like that I knew would be in there. But it was actually surprisingly difficult to pick other reviews, to find things that linked into the themes that I was looking for. Also held up as writing, didn't make me cringe in the way that, obviously when you look back at your old writing, and matched also with the other longer essays and profiles. So it was a little bit of a puzzle piece thing. But the main thing is I knew that I was looking for pieces that express certain ideas that I had hit over the years and come back to and turned around in new ways. And I wasn't looking for pieces about the best shows. Mm-hmm. And that was the thing that I was worried would come across to readers is, somebody reading an essay on Jessica Jones. Jessica Jones is not one of my favorite shows. It's actually kind of a mixed review, but it makes an argument that fits into the argument the book makes. So, basically I printed everything out, I piled it up, and then I put it into yes, no, maybe piles, and then I tried to put it in the correct order. So in a way, it's actually very simple.
Had there been any push from the editors to go with those canonical Sopranos, Wire, Breaking Bad, Mad Men?
They didn't have to push. I wanted to go with the canonical ones.
Yeah?
I mean, I like those. Like everybody, there are some pieces of mine that I like better than others. The Sopranos piece is important to me because it not only is, I think, a good piece that holds up, but it was an early piece for me that made a more ambitious statement about TV. But the main thing about it is that it's about the relationship between the audience and television. It's about how super fans of The Sopranos pissed the creator of The Sopranos off so much that the show became colder and more punishing, which in turn made the show particularly brilliant, ambitious, and iconoclastic. That's a theme I knew I wanted to cover in the book. At one point, I had thought about writing a book called The Audience, because I think TV has such a unique relationship with its audience, and I felt like that piece established that. At one point, I thought about making a chapter just called Endings or Finales or something, because I realized that some of the pieces I like the best, even if they were about the whole show, they were sort of about the last episode. So there's a piece on The Sopranos. The Sex and the City piece is about the ending. The Lost piece is about the ending. I had written some stuff on Breaking Bad that's not in the book that is also about the ending of Breaking Bad. And I had this idea that those would make a good chapter. But when it came down to actually putting the book together, it didn't really make sense to separate things out like that. I wanted it to sort of walk through. I have little sections, girls, in praise of sex and violence. But by and large, it really is just a book that goes through stuff and is not separated off into sections.
And can you characterize the argument about TV?
The argument about TV.
As I know you've done this a whole bunch.
Which is mine. No, yeah, I know. It's one of those things where it's like, say what your book is about.
But I figured we should get it in front of the audience first.
The basic argument is that it's a book that advocates for celebrating television as television and detaching it from anxious comparisons to books and movies, which were art forms that were more traditionally taken seriously. Part of what the book talks about is the fact that for decades, TV was treated as garbage and with enormous condescension and with enormous anxiety, not as an art form, but as basically an addiction, something that was bad for you, something that was at best entertaining but stupid and commercial, at worst literally corrosive to your brain, like the way they talk about the internet now. So the argument the book makes is that we need to abandon the status anxiety that's essentially a hangover from that earlier era and learn to celebrate television in the broader way that is not just about shows like The Sopranos, that you can basically say, this is good because it's not like TV. It's about celebrating shows that actually very much are like TV. And I talk a lot in the opening essay about my primal experience with Buffy the Vampire Slayer, a very ambitious show that could never in any logical way be compared to a book or a movie. That is a very network-looking, structured, very TV-like, formulaic in its way, but to me was as important and meaningful and beautiful a show as The Sopranos. That's the essential argument of the book. But, of course, as with anything, there's a bunch of other things. Yeah. Some of them about TV, like celebrating collaboration, celebrating archness and formula. There's definitely stuff about expanding the range of the kinds of people who make TV that are talked about and the kinds of stories that are told, and talking about women in TV and talking about the enormous expansion in the last few years of gay stories by Black people, made by Black people, and all of that kind of thing. But also about genres that get marginalized, soap operas, reality shows, and basically finding the language to talk about those things as well, instead of just perseverating about anti-hero shows.
Yeah, one of the neat things, this is going to sound terrible and don't take it in a bad way, almost everything you review is something I haven't watched.
I know there are some readers for whom that will be true, but it's ironic because, of course, there's so much TV.
Which is part of
there are other people where it's the opposite, where these are the shows.
The only things. Yeah. Because it's like a Borges thing. Had I not known they existed, I was like, she could be making all these shows up. This is great.
That's true. That is what I did.
But there's
a few Easter eggs in there.
Right. In the credits afterwards. Yes. Just kidding. But it does lead to the question, though, when did you, even though it's your job, realize and accept that you just can't keep up with everything?
Well, there's a specific date for this, and it's the date that John Landgraf said.
Was it the peak TV moment?
It literally was the peak TV moment. Like John Landgraf, who people were always calling the mayor of TV, he was the president of FX, was at the Television Critics Association. I wasn't actually there. I remember reading about it on Twitter, but he put up a bunch of charts that showed the exponential increase of television and how it was just shooting upwards in just the sheer number of shows being produced was untenable. And he said it was a bubble that needed to pop, and there wasn't enough space, money, talent, all of these kinds of things. But also the main thing for critics is there's not enough time to watch all the shows. I think this was in 2012.
Yeah.
So his prediction that it would burst did not come true. Yeah, because it was, it was around the time Netflix, I think, was beginning its ascent. There was a big struggle industry-wise between places like FX and places like Netflix, which are and have increasingly become all about more and more and more. But I have to say, as horrified as I was by the prospect of there being so much TV, I was also extremely relieved. And I think I'm not the only television critic specifically who felt this way, because before that, I hadn't been able to watch every show, but at least I took some pride in trying to be conversant in the most important shows. But now I knew I couldn't be. So I had to let go and let God. And there was a certain point at which I was like, I need to try to watch a lot of TV, but it would destroy my life to try to watch all the TV, and it wouldn't actually improve my writing. At a certain point, you just can't keep up. So I keep a list of shows. I ask people for shows to watch, but I also just accept that sometimes there's going to be a great or popular, which are different things. Like there'll be a great show that I miss, or there'll be a show everyone's talking about that I never weigh in on. So I try to mix things up, and I have my own little rules, but I've dropped my initial plan for genuinely trying
doing the Ozymandias thing from The Watchmen and just having 50 TVs on all the time.
I don't know the Ozymandias.
That was from the 80s. It was
I remember The Watchmen because I used to read it over.
Ozymandias was the guy who was plotting the whole thing. There was one scene of him in his room with all of these TVs everywhere, and he's absorbing the entire universe.
I've seen that. I've seen that image. Actually, I was thinking trying to do the Tom Cruise thing from Minority Report, where he's shifting everything around, which always struck me as exactly although I'm not trying to predict crimes on the parts of shows. So.
On the other hand, it could be a good, as you sort of allude to with an essay that we'll talk about a little bit later in the conversation. Do you ever wonder what this job would have been like for you in the pre-peak era? Well,
it's even
because you had the boomlet era.
Leaving aside the pre-peak era, what's really striking to me, and I allude to this in a lot of the different essays I've written on TV. And I've always wanted to write something that's more specifically about this. But of course, as with many art forms, TV is a technology. It's a creative expression, but it's shaped by the way in which it's made, the way in which it's distributed, the way in which it's experienced. And the technology has changed so radically, even during the time that from me being a child to an adult, that defining it has changed. It's still episodic, but when I was growing up, it used to just pour into your living room seemingly live. I mean, it was taped, but you couldn't pause it or rewind it or anything. And then VCRs came along, but they were kind of clunky. You could use them, but you couldn't share them. The internet came along and DVRs and now streaming. And so I think that changes the job a lot, because at this point I have access to screeners that I can pause and rewind and examine. And I often get several episodes at a time, sometimes a whole season. So for people reviewing shows in the Precambrian era or whatever, what does Precambrian mean?
It's just the word we use when we want to say way back.
Okay. Yeah, I literally have no idea what it means, and I don't think I've ever said it aloud, but it sounded very fancy. Yeah. Anyway, I've read a lot of older television criticism, and it is fascinating because a lot of times people were writing about things that they'd seen but couldn't revisit to fact check, or they were writing about their impressions of them. And some of that is actually weirdly powerful, because that is one way of watching TV. I mean, in some ways, it's more like being a theater critic. I mean, although shows air every night and you could probably make sure you got the lines right. But there's some of this early stuff where people would be watching like a news show, and then they would be writing down notes and they would just write their impression of it. At this point, when I watch a show, I can rewatch a scene several times, and TV is a lot more visually ambitious. So that changes it as well. But yeah, if I'd been watching it earlier, I mean, when I first started writing about TV, I was getting VCR discs, like not even DVDs. I remember I watched the first episode of Lost. They sent me a VCR thing, and I remember going into the so yeah, I like reading older television criticism that comes from the perspective of someone who's just watching the thing live. But
and when you saw that first episode of Lost, did you really think the finale was going to let you down that much, ultimately? Actually,
I was blown away. But first of all, that year, I was not a writer. I mean, I wrote for the magazine as well, but I was the editor of the culture section at New York Magazine. So I was trying to select things for us to cover for our fall preview issue. And it was the only year when I actually pinpointed the two shows. I literally was like, Lost and Desperate Housewives will be big hits.
Nice.
Every other year, I pick things that literally were
crickets.
Yeah, were canceled after 4 episodes. I have no commercial sense. I'm not in. I like a lot of shows that get low ratings, but that one year, and I will say that the Lost first episode completely holds up when you watch it. Like it genuinely, even now, feels new and strange and fresh, and it's such a great concept, and it has these vivid images like Locke with his orange peel in his teeth and all of these kinds of things. It's really great. And my piece that I wrote about Lost is not just about the finale, it's about the fact that the show was actually about something in the first few seasons, aside from being an adventure, and it actually had provocative themes that were in a lot of ways about a post 9/11 world and people coping with disasters. And those were kind of fizzled away because of the necessities of serving the audience in a plot. But luckily, as I say in the book, Damon Lindelof got back at me by making The Leftovers. Yeah. Because the same themes only pulls them off. So.
Well, it was a line I had. I've rarely watched the show at all. My wife was into it, Westworld, which when I tried watching it with her, I said, this show seems like it's about writing an episode of Westworld. It doesn't seem like it has any...
I didn't include Did you read my review of that? No. It's not in the book. That's, yeah.
Exactly it. Okay, because, that was my vibe trying to watch it with her. I'm like, this is just about trying to write a show to get the fans on the internet talking in a way that drives...
It's absolutely... I mean, I will say... I'm not a fan of Westworld. Yeah. It is very visually beautiful.
Oh, yeah, all these shows. They put so much into them.
Speculative fiction show that's about the nature of robots and humanity, it has something provocative and cool about it. But I did think it was kind of BS and very self-serious, at least in the first season. I sort of fell behind on it. But when I wrote the review, that's literally what it was about. It was about... The show is about the neuroses of showrunners who are simultaneously trying to be popular, create something original, and collaborate with people that they're not getting along with. And I actually wrote, perhaps a little far-reachingly, that the show seemed to be about the history of television, because TV originated with cowboy shows. Like
Sure.
all of the shows that later on network became cops and robbers, Law and Order shows were Westerns, Rawhide and all those shows, and they filled prime time. So there was something about the fact that it was this modern robotic HBO show that was about
Something
about
from
a
the
cowboy
origins
show
of TV.
was interesting to me potentially, and I was kind of grading it. I gave it like a mixed review, grading it slightly on a curve because it was like, those are potentially interesting themes, but they, sexually that show makes no sense. And among other things, if you had a taboo landscape in which people could fulfill any fantasy, I don't think what would be going on is that they would just have the most sort of basic frat boy kinds of ideas about sexy women. It would be much more far out and frankly harder to show on screen. But that's neither here nor there because the show is just like, I don't know. I felt like it was weirdly familiar for something that was so sleek and sophisticated. But, the next season looks kind of interesting. I feel like I should revisit it to see.
Yeah, how often do you do that?
I mean, when I pan something, I try to keep watching the show. Because I think maybe it'll change and I'll change my mind. It's one of the things that's unique to TV. I mean, novels don't suddenly improve after you review them, but TV shows sometimes do.
There are books you go back to, though, and find they're far better than...
That's
they
absolutely
somehow
true.
got better in the intervening 10 years
Yeah, like you
or so.
change and you see it through different eyes. But TV is literally being made in front of you, and you are changing, and the person making the show is changing. And so it's not just your responses to it. The funny thing about what I'm saying about, and what you're saying as well about Westworld being about making TV is I feel like so many TV shows are about making TV in a way that's really artistically fruitful, but also kind of funny. Like I basically have this theory that almost all workplace shows are actually coded shows about the frustrations of their writers and creators because they're all about collaborative staffs overseen by a frustrated, eccentric who often has a grandiose self-image and is trying to get all of these smart but resentful eccentrics to work together. So whether the show is actually about a TV show like 30 Rock or whether it's about a CSI squad, I feel like a lot of workplace shows have a strong relationship to TV itself. So in that way, Westworld is really just a very fancy, pretentious, high-end workplace show. It's just a drama and it's made with enormous amounts of money. And so it feels different. But it actually is about a group of workers trying to produce something. So it bears a relationship to like the Dick Van Dyke Show or something like that.
Do you have an office or do you work here?
I mostly work here. I have an office at the New Yorker and I do go in for part of the week. I like seeing people. I'm social. And it's nice to work there too. But my husband's also a writer and will just work from home. I don't have a separate office in the house. Sometimes I'll go to a bar or cafe and work, but bring headphones, watch things on my computer. So.
Yeah, and how much of a confidentiality life does that involve in terms of...
What do you mean?
Oh, somebody gives you a season of something that, and you're not allowed to talk about what, spoiler, this or that.
It's never occurred to me that I can't talk about the screeners. And most TV shows... It's not like they're legal cases. I just watched the new season of Glow. The embargo is out on July 19th. I mean, I don't think it's a problem for me to actually talk about the show. It's just I can't write about it. It's different with each place. Also, I'm not watching things so far in advance that I would spoil their initial publicity or something. I don't think that that's an issue. I talk about TV all the time because I want to get other people's opinions.
Yeah, I just didn't know friends try and pump you for, what's going to happen on the next season of blah, blah, blah.
It's very occasional, like something like Game of Thrones. But people also who are fans of a show don't actually want to know what's happening. They just want to know whether it's good or not.
Yeah. And then pan you on the internet for not liking the thing that they like.
Yeah, although not friends.
Yeah, you hope.
I have a very weird friend who asks me for what's happening, then gets annoyed at me. I mean, by and large, look, the internet is a mess, but I love it and am on Twitter a lot and I criticize things. People have the right to criticize me. That's the way of the world. I don't actually feel like I get that much abuse about stuff, with very few exceptions. Like I say in the book, but my negative review of True Detective led to years of literally handwritten letters, which I found kind of loving.
It totally holds up, though, because I was around the same point you were when I thought, I don't think there's an awful lot here.
Yes.
And my wife was also like, yeah. And there's not a whole lot from me in this show, Gil. I'm like, okay, so that's it. And then by the end, it turned into an Alan Moore.
It's one of these
ripoff.
weird things because I wrote that piece like 3/4 of the way through the season at the absolute height of the hype and bloviation about how this was great genius. And yet you can't quite tell until the last 2 episodes that all of the
just how bad it was.
All of the sort of, pseudo mystical mystique part that was part of what was keeping it going. And I think I say in the review, I'm like, if it turns out it's Cthulhu with the candlestick in the living room, I am on board. Like, honestly, if it had been like full on batshit supernatural weirdness, but I was like, it's not. It's actually just, it's not that there's nothing watchable or interesting about the show, but that sometimes there's a piece that's written in a specific time period, and that piece is written specifically to puncture the overhype for the show. Yep. So when I reread it, it was almost uncomfortable to read because I was like, oh my God, it's so swashbuckling and obnoxious. But I feel like television criticism specifically is a conversation. I come out of online conversations, and I was a big poster on Television Without Pity. And to me, the debate quality of TV that takes place over time is actually part of the allure of TV criticism. And I know this is somewhat true of other kinds of criticism, but I think it's particularly true of TV. And so there are pieces in this book that I can see when I read them, and I've sometimes noted them at the beginning. It comes out of 3/4 of the way through the first season of True Detective, or this is during the second season of Girls, when every freaking think piece was about girls in this insane way. So the pieces have this kind of historical shudder of all of the anxieties.
Well, the contexts are perfect. I've been doing those setups before each one is I think, critical because, again, just reading the one on the Americans, which is, as you put it, the one that nailed the finale. And I watched the finale again after finishing the book, and it was just, God damn.
It is really,
just,
it's really great.
But I think it's also a very, and we're not going to go too deep into individual shows, but I think there are many aspects of that show that lent it to being able to do that in terms of not overpromising and having a very realist frame. It never had the visual grandeur. It didn't have a lot of the elements that other shows relied on, and didn't have the white middle class flawed antihero.
It's true. It's beautiful, but in a talking about the Americans.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, not an American. I mean, it has to me, that show is very much a response to antihero shows. But you're right that it doesn't have the grittiness in that way. It's actually an allegory about marriage and intimacy.
Which you also nailed exactly the point that I made from the beginning, which was it's a couple who have to trust each other, and when they love each other, it falls apart.
Yeah.
It's a love that ends up revealing their identity.
It's about how vulnerable it is for people to know your actual needs or secrets. It's such a powerful show. It's interesting because I didn't think about structuring the book this way, but as much as there are several of these major antihero dramas, some of which I love, like I said, I'm a big Sopranos fan. I liked most of Breaking Bad, although I have
the last 2 episodes were superfluous.
Specifically, the last episode. It was one of the weird shows where the last episode made me question a lot of things about the earlier seasons, and so I have more. I've always wanted to write like an aftermath piece about that. But there's a lot of those shows but it's still an incredibly skillfully made, very beautiful show. So there are a lot of those shows I like, and then there are a lot of copycat versions of the shows that I think are actually kind of crap or are just unsuccessful and pompous and stuff like that. But then there are shows like The Americans, and actually shows like BoJack Horseman, that are like responses within television to the problems of the rise of the antihero narrative. And that's what's so beautiful about TV to me is, you can't necessarily see shows just separate from one another. Often they are couched responses to tensions that were raised several years before by another popular show. And part of the purpose of the book is to say, let's talk about TV history and compare TV shows to TV shows rather than trying to say, oh, you should watch this. It's like Dickens. Yeah. Like I'm saying, no, it's actually more fruitful to talk about the way that all mockumentary shows are responses to reality shows, or the way in which the traumatic experience of the people making your show of shows led to Dick Van Dyke, which then led to every kind of major breakthrough sitcom that is critical of television and remakes the nature of TV comedy. So to me, that's the more fun and logical and helpful way in a lot of ways to talk about TV.
Can you talk about how the binge model versus the weekly model impacts either what you do or TV itself?
It is my dream and my nightmare.
Yeah.
I mean, it is really this thing where I've spent years building up, this theory about the specific nature of what makes TV different. And the ideas of what makes it different are it's episodic, it's made collaboratively, historically for economic reasons. It tends to value words more than images, which has obviously changed a lot. And it's historically been based on formula because in early TV you needed to be able to replicate each episode to make them the same. And then the final one is it has this looping relationship with time. So because it comes out weekly over years, the show changes in response to the audience. Boom. A lot of these things have altered, but streaming has really altered that last one. When a show comes out 10 or 12 episodes at a time, and then everyone watches them at different times, it changes the conversation about TV. It changes the way that people make the TV because they don't get to respond to people. And so I'm still adjusting to that. I mean, one of the things I note sort of mournfully in the opening chapter is a lot of the things that I've been evangelizing for and kind of beating my hand on the table about, like, this is what TV is, are to some extent not what TV is. So both the increased visual nature of TV as the money of it changes and as directors pour in, and the streaming thing with binging and shows coming out all at once are really challenging to me as a critic. And they're also surprisingly new. People don't remember. It's literally just the last 5 years, right?
But we're in this world now where everything this is the way it's always been, where we have no historical context for things.
Although that's both true and not true, because actually the opposite is true with TV, because suddenly people have access to old TV shows and they never did.
Listen, I watch almost nothing during the 90s.
Right.
My wife and I spent a few months last year. This is going to sound terrible.
It's going to be ER. Frasier's so great.
It's one of the greatest. And from beginning to end, it was one of those, like, they knew from pretty much episode 1. They had it. The formula was down. They knew the characters. They had everything laid out. You could run that for 11 seasons. It's a beautiful show. It really is. It's also unusually consistent sitcom, I think. Yeah. Don't you find? It was only in a couple later seasons once Niles and
Daphne. A lot of people object to the Daphne getting fat sequence because she was pregnant, right?
Yeah,
so they wrote. I have to say, I know in practice it didn't work perfectly, but I had to admire they actually came up with a psychological logic to the arc and a breakthrough that she would have, and I kind of admired that instead of just having her carry a bunch of big plants around. But yes,
you heard that Larry David proposed that to Julia Louis-Dreyfus when she was pregnant on Seinfeld, right?
Oh, that she just carry?
No, that they pretend she's just getting fatter and fatter.
Oh, that's very cool.
All season long, and she flipped out and then realized afterwards that would have been perfect. It would have been so
I have to say, it would make
perfect.
More sense for Seinfeld because first of all, that's something that could absolutely happen to the character. What's her name? Elaine. Yeah. And it would be kind of interesting. Yeah, she was offended and realized afterwards, I should have done it. That would have been it. So. She's made otherwise very good decisions in her career, so I forgive her for that. When she was pregnant, did she just carry stuff around? I forget how they handled it. I never watched Seinfeld. I watched almost nothing in the 90s. Oh, that's so I mysteriously just had this like 10-year gap of TV, which I still think I came out ahead on. But the thing is, the 90s actually has a lot of good TV. I mark in this book the period of real change. Here's the point where we had to take her dog, Bella, out for walkies. Just so you know, during that part, we kept talking about TV. In this case, we talked a little about the Americans and this really amazing redeeming storyline within the middle of it. We also got into my past podcast with Brett Martin, who wrote the book Difficult Men, about the showrunners / creators of those white middle-aged anti-hero shows, and how much she loved Difficult Men, and how Brett appreciated that by sending her a t-shirt with the Difficult Women logo on it. I forget where we left off. But so let's see. We were talking about... in a sense, how the internet changes your job. Yes. Well, I love the internet. I'm not somebody who can put down something that essentially created my writing style and provides me with daily entertainment, information, and company. So I fully recognize the downside of things online. But I think you have to... When you talk about, I know what we were talking about. We were talking about... 90s TV and how you hadn't watched a lot of 90s TV, but this is actually crucial because when TV changed in a lot of ways because of the technology about it, and also specifically because of discussions online. And those began in the 90s. Mm. And for me, those began in the 90s also, because I was on Usenet, before Television Without Pity. And it was just refreshing, actually, to be exposed to conversations about television that were by enthusiasts. I mean, a lot of those were fan boards, which didn't mean that they didn't have criticism. Actually, they had virulent criticism, but it was the nature of that passion about shows rather than a sort of distant, snooty, oh, that little show is doing something kind of ambitious, how impressive, that really affected me and kind of made me want to write the kind of criticism I wrote later on. But you didn't watch TV in the 90s. And I do kind of superficially mark the beginning of this new stage of TV around 1997 to 1999 sure. when The Sopranos and Buffy came out. But, I mean, there were actually several excellent shows in the 90s. Have you ever watched My So-Called Life and Freaks and Geeks?
Yeah, that I saw back when I was in grad school. I think that had started like 93 to 95 around there. But yeah, I managed to miss the entirety of Seinfeld. Never seen an episode of Friends. It's one of those things where, on balance, I think it came out okay.
It's fine. But, I mean, yeah. I like those shows. It's odd. I loved Seinfeld when it was on. I used to watch it with friends every week. I don't really revisit it that often the way I do like 30 Rock.
We're working our way through that one again.
I love 30 Rock. It's one of my favorite shows, and that also is a dark comedy with a cynical streak. But it's not the nihilism of Seinfeld that I mind. There's something about it that doesn't speak to me right now. But I loved it at the time. And the thing is, it was a huge breakthrough for TV because it was, as I'm saying about TV responding to other TV, it was a no hugging, no learning show that was a response to the corny family shows of the 80s. So it was very useful. And I like Friends, actually. Yeah. I think Friends is a good show.
I liked episodes when it started.
I liked episodes as well.
Yeah.
You really could trace this thing.
I catch the meta version of something as opposed to the thing itself.
Well, actually, in its way, The Comeback. Have you seen The Comeback?
No. Again, your book is like Borges's fictional catalog of TV shows Gil has never seen. I heard about it and heard it's wonderful, and the 2 seasons apart are supposed to be amazing.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, in a way, it was an advantage that the 2 seasons came so separate because they were able to respond to different stages in TV. But you could really trace a thing that goes from Seinfeld and Friends to Larry David and Episodes and The Comeback, and how these shows all are responses to and in relationship to one another. But of those, The Comeback is, I think, the masterpiece. And that is, of all the workplace shows about the writer's room, the darkest. But Episodes I liked. I used to argue with Alan Sepinwall about this all the time. He doesn't like the show.
I thought the later seasons, meh, but early on it was...
The first season I thought was...
Hands down.
And I was just saying this to someone. I was like, it's a season that literally takes Matt LeBlanc's penis and uses it as Chekhov's gun. like it literally puts it on the table in the first episode and then has it go off by the last episode. And I thought that was very funny and effective. But the main thing I liked about the show was that it told this really poignant story in this comedic form of a very confident middle-aged woman who's very smart and successful British writer who goes to LA and slowly turns into the way that people see her, which is as a boring woman who's not hot enough, who talks too much and all this kind of thing. And it's sort of about the way that people's eyes on you change you into the thing that is like your worst monster self. So I think it's a good show, but some people find it a turnoff because they don't like the sitcom beats, which is what it is and what it's about. I mean, I don't think it's the greatest show since sliced bread, but...
There's a reason it's a half hour.
Well, I'm a person who's extremely interested in half hours and comedies. I think they're often better than modern dramas. And that one fits squarely into my wheelhouse because it was just a show about that subject. But the 90s show, so you saw My So-Called Life. Did you see Freaks and Geeks?
No, years later. Saw the first couple of episodes on DVD, but haven't finished it.
The X-Files?
No, never watched a single episode.
The shows that I think
of... This huge cultural gap.
The shows I think of as crucial, the crucial 90s shows are The X-Files, My So-Called Life, Freaks and Geeks, and Seinfeld. I'm trying to think if there were any other ones. I mean, there were a handful of interesting shows during that period that are such good shows that they are the source of all the later shows. Mm-hmm. I think Joss Whedon would say that Buffy was literally My So-Called Life plus The X-Files. My So-Called Life, even though it only ran for 1 season, was, I think, such a transformative show because it just showed, ironically, I guess, since it's a teen show, that TV could handle adult emotional subject matter in a thoughtful, powerful, like multi-layered character way. It's filmed in a slightly different way. It's part of a tradition of shows like that go back to 30-something, but I thought it was really a big high point. But it ran for one season and I guess was successful, but just didn't get picked up. I don't think it did poorly, but sometimes a show that is just a short thing can still have enormous impact on every other show on TV.
And sometimes it's for the best.
Yeah.
You know, as you talk about in the Ryan Murphy profile with seasons 1 and 2.
Well, you know something? That was the opinion of Ryan's partner.
That's true.
Like, I agree to some extent that Ryan Murphy shows sometimes fly off the rails, but I also think it's the kind of insult that people just apply willy-nilly, whether it's true or not. Because the truth is sometimes things fly back on the rails. Like, it's not so clear. Like, Friends actually is an example of show that, you know, there's this model of the jump the shark thing. That show, like, jumped back and forth in quality during its run. And I think that's not uncommon with TV. But yeah, I actually wish they had a second season of My So-Called Life. But that's because I think those parents would have gotten divorced, and that had never been shown on TV up to that point. But now, like, it's a lot of families that have gotten divorced on TV. So they're just things that you couldn't show in the early decades of TV, which have been showed so many times that they've become cliches. So that's just the nature of a big mass medium.
Was there any pressure to produce a list with the book, like Harold Bloom with the Western Canon, when he unfortunately had to
Nobody
produce
was pressuring me to
list?
produce a list. Every December I write a piece about how much I hate lists.
Yeah,
you know,
that's what I was wondering, if they still had but you know, we need to sell it with something, and how about...
Some of my best friends make lists, but I used to make lists myself, but I don't like top 10 lists. And sometimes I knuckle and I do something at the end of the year, because, you know, people just want recommendations. I get that. It's the numerical part of it that I find really off-putting, false to my nature, and an opportunity to write rants. So I don't like that stuff. But in this particular case, I had to write a writer's note at the beginning that says this is not a list. Yeah. Because, I mean, also, this book literally doesn't contain essays about some of my absolute favorite shows on TV, because the pieces I've written about them didn't fit the purpose of this, or I thought they were good, but they weren't the ones that I wanted to see reprinted, you know, for whatever reason.
Is there any temptation to touch things up, or is it really, this is how it ran, this is how it goes in? I touched very few things up. There was one paragraph in the True Detective piece which struck me as overly overridden. Basically, it was a little confusing and it was a little operatic and it's a very True Detective
voicey piece. Yeah, you know, there is this weird thing where you sometimes mimic the show. I once wrote a piece I quite like for the web about Newsroom, about a bad episode on Aaron Sorkin's The Newsroom, and I literally in the piece say, criticizing Aaron Sorkin shows turns you into an Aaron Sorkin character. You're like delivering a crazed rant. You're walking down a hall. Like, so I think that there was something about that piece that mimics True Detective in its sort of, over the top, slightly self-serious, operatic, voicey qualities. But there's one paragraph in it that I detangled because I basically was like, this is overridden. And I think I changed. So that was one piece. And then was there anything else? I changed very little. I really didn't rewrite pieces. I was like their representative, their
That's
period.
What I figured.
And you know, every once in a while there would be something that was like mildly dated that wouldn't make sense to readers, and so I would rewrite the sentence or trim it. But it really was like 4 things throughout the book. Most of the things I just left completely as is. Like the Joan Rivers piece, I don't think had anything changed in it.
Yeah, with some cartoonists, when they are collecting a giant piece, it's, well, let me just go back to the earlier stuff and fix those hands, and then they realize they're going to spend 2 years drawing all that, and they give up and just go with the work as it is.
It's part of what's nice because this piece has new work as well.
Yeah,
but
we're going to talk about that next.
But the older pieces, I liked the fact that I could write a little thing at the beginning that basically was either a joke or explained my frame of mind, because it's weird. It's about, not, the pieces are mostly written within the last, 10 years, but it's about the last 20 years of TV. And it is pretty shocking how even pieces that I wrote just a few years ago need an introduction that explains what that period was like, because history seems to be speeding up.
So there are 2 new pieces in it, but the one that's going to garner the most attention, or the more attention, is your Life as a Human Shield.
Confessions of a Human Shield.
Confessions of a Human Shield, which centers around the Me Too as it's continuing to unfold and the art of bad people.
Yeah, it's a piece that I wrote specifically because of the timing of my book leave. Mm-hmm. I was planning to write 4 shorter essays on subjects like collaboration and some of the things we're talking about. And my leave was October through December of 2017. And that's exactly when the Harvey Weinstein expose came out and the whole thing broke open. And every day was another painful, illuminating piece of investigative journalism. And so I don't think I'm the only one who was like this during that period, but I couldn't think about anything else. So it was kind of what I had to write about. And it's a big piece that's both a personal essay and also an analytical piece wrestling with the question of separating the artist from the art and what that means specifically for arts critics, but obviously it's something that applies to everyone to some extent. In an odd way, it's both a finished piece that I feel good about. It's, a big, ambitious piece, and I think it holds up, but it's also a symptom of a period in flux. I mean, it's about me thinking out loud about my own history, about the history of art, about my relationship with these kinds of things. And it has some relationship to what we're talking about anti-hero shows and sort of bad guys that break the rules. So that's what the piece is. But it was weird because it's genuinely true that if I had my leave 3 months before, that would not be in the book. It would be a different thing.
And if you started writing that essay now, do you feel like it'd be different? Things would have changed enough, or at least your experience with it, or not?
I don't know. I might have written something now. I just wrote a piece for The New Yorker about it's almost like a parallel piece to this, because this piece is about me and my responses to things. And so it's a little more memoiristic. It's like an intellectual memoir in that way. But I wrote a piece for The New Yorker that's about television shows and how they've reacted to the Me Too movement. And it's about a different version of the same thing. It's about shows looking back at their own histories and then reconsidering earlier plots, or like Younger is based on a relationship between a boss and an employee at a publishing company. And that show literally had to rework the central premise of the show in order to acknowledge Me Too and the changed ways of looking at this. And I think very successfully. And, I talked, I'm not sure, I think it's in the piece, but I remember with my boss, with David Remnick on the New Yorker radio show, about how weird it is to look at Cheers, for instance. So that piece is about, which is about charming, sexualized, romanticized sexual harassment within the bar. Like that's, and I can hear people like piping, that's not what it's about, but I'm telling you, that's, yeah. I will say that's something that always bothered me a little bit about Cheers. Even when I was a teenage girl, I had it's a whole separate thing. And it was one of the essays I was going to write was actually about Diane Chambers and that whole thing. So it's ironic that I wrote this instead. But yeah, that's what the piece is about. And I think if I was writing it now, I might write about the same subject, but in a slightly different way. But isn't that always true? So
my only 2 nitpicky things. One was you bring up Bill Cosby in relation to, again, cancel culture and other aspects of this. It was something he himself practiced with the Little Rascals thing when he bought up the rights. And
did he get rid of the Little Rascals because he found them racist? Is that right?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, that was I don't want people seeing these renditions. I don't want kids seeing these renditions of black people.
That's so interesting. I wish I had known that. He hated Archie Bunker. Yeah. And he had no ability to cancel All in the Family, but he frequently spoke about, but those are different because that's actually about getting rid of something because you think it's racist, rather than getting rid of something because of what the person who made it did.
There's a very different and problematic, those differences are significant, but
so can nobody see the Little Rascals?
As far as I know, he had the rights locked up years ago and has never relinquished. I don't know if he's going to end up selling them to pay off whatever bills he's got left. But
that would be ironic. Yeah. That's really fascinating because I grew up watching the Little Rascals, and I recently had read somebody basically defending them within the time period as saying, obviously it is a kind of horrendous minstrelsy on the show, but there is a quality to it where it was portraying a multiracial group of friends.
Yeah, I was going to say it's integrated.
I mean, it's a weird thing to say, but it's like a strange thing about looking at old TV where you want to talk about. But of course, I haven't seen the show for years, so I or anyone else might look at it and just be like, nobody should ever look upon this again, which is, I guess, what he felt. Yeah.
And if you have the resources to do that, if you become successful enough that you can say, this is something that I think is terrible. Yeah. My other one is Husbands and Wives by Woody Allen.
Yes.
You bring up Judy Davis, her achievement at the end, reconnecting
great
with Sidney Pollack and not Liam Neeson, et cetera. The only thing about that is it actually, at the very sort of meta end of it, portrays Mia Farrow as the horrible manipulative one who actually gets everything she wants by wrecking the relationship between Liam Neeson and Judy Davis, and manipulating the entire thing throughout, which when you start to get back, you realize he kind of cast Mia Farrow in that horrible manipulative role again and again throughout those movies right before everything fell apart.
There's no doubt.
Yeah.
I mean, Mia Farrow is in many ways the villain of that movie, although there is something really powerful about the portrait of somebody getting things by acting,
whatever means they have.
Well, no, but also by acting weak. Like, yeah. But my point in the piece is a little bit different. I know. That's a complicated movie.
Yeah. And very difficult to watch.
Really? Do you find it hard to watch?
Even it come out after the scandal, of course, but the scene with Sidney Pollack and the young girlfriend is one of the most painful things I've ever seen in my life. I can't believe I'm defending things
in a Woody Allen movie, but because somebody just brought up that scene, and that scene is incredibly painful to watch.
I don't mean it shouldn't have been filmed. I
feel like the scene is supposed to be horrible.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think you're supposed to sympathize with him hitting her or any of that stuff. I think you're supposed to see him like losing his mind. She is portrayed as a vapid, impossible, like she's talking about astrology at the party and stuff. But I think that his fit at her is not portrayed sympathetically at all.
No. And that's what makes it, I don't mean painful in terms of, oh my God, he's glorifying it. It's I've seen that happen in my parents' divorce. So I know,
it's a pretty terrifying
scene. Yeah,
it's also really tragic because he was with her because he felt like she would be the supportive, loving, uncomplicated person. And he basically treats her cruelly because she's exactly who he knew she was at the beginning. And she ends up being very exploited. I mean, I think that's a pretty complicated movie. The main thing I was talking about in that movie, though, was the young woman character in the movie Rain. And the Judy Davis character, because I don't know. I'm loath to describe the argument I make in the piece because I'm pretty clear about my attitudes toward Woody Allen. I was a major Woody Allen fan growing up. My entire sensibility was very shaped by Woody Allen. I believe Dylan Farrow, and I'm left with a set of questions about what this means about his art, what this means about my relationship with his art, what this means about justice in the world, all of this kind of stuff. And I talk about that in the essay. I'm kind of hesitant to walk through my analysis of Husbands and Wives, except to say that I do think it's an excellent movie. I mean, I
think it's his last.
His last excellent movie? I'm trying to think, because there are later movies that I actually do find queasy in the way that you're talking about. For instance, I hated Blue Jasmine. It's specifically because, I also didn't think it was a good movie, but specifically because it literally mimics what happened with Soon-Yi in the movie in this very cruel parody of a character in the Mia Farrow position. And that actually is a movie where I was just like, screw you. I could not detach myself. For whatever reason, either the time I watched Husbands and Wives or my feelings about the movie, I feel like that movie holds up, for a variety of different reasons, and is in many ways not the opposite of, but complicates the way that people view movies like that. But, I think, what can I say? I can't say that I don't think some of his movies are good. Some of his movies are great. But the movie that really, and again, this is different than this is different than his status as a human being in the world. Yeah. The movie that really grossed me out was actually Anything Else. That movie I think it was the last. I apparently saw Blue Jasmine. I don't think I've seen anything since Blue Jasmine. But I don't know whether that's canceling somebody or whether that's just not seeing movies by an artist
falling into irrelevance.
Started, finding just generally disappointing. There's another question that's involved with giving money to the person and the ethical questions of that, and I talk about all these things in the essay because a lot of them are things where I'm genuinely wrestling with them. I talk about this, but I'm natively disinclined to a cancellation deletion mindset, partially because as a critic, I feel like when there are screwed up art pieces that were enormously powerful, or when there were beautiful, powerful art pieces that are by somebody who's a real shit, the pieces still existed. They affected the other art. They affected people. And as a critic, it still seems valuable to wrestle with them. But how is the question? Yeah. And in the case of Bill Cosby, I say specifically in the piece, like, I was not a fan of Bill Cosby. I did not even love The Cosby Show when it was on. I loved A Different World, but I didn't love A Cosby Show. And in a weird way, that makes it easier for me to make the case that you should not delete The Cosby Show, that you actually need as a critic to wrestle with it. But that's partially because I don't feel particularly connected to it the way that I do with Woody Allen. So, you know, I think everyone has to work these things out with them for themselves. The piece is meant as a lens into one person's version of this. And I think for both men and women, I think I say this in the piece. I say it in a different piece that I wrote about a great movie called The Tale. Have you seen that?
No, I don't know.
It's about a woman thinking back on she was molested as a child, but she had spent years thinking of it as a mutual relationship. And then in her 40s, as an adult artist, she goes back and kind of recognizes that it was this horrendous, grotesque, traumatic exploitation. But she can't get the two to match. Like, her younger self became who she was because of her interpretation of it, and her older self wishes she could warn and stop her younger self. And so that's what that movie, which is a brilliant movie, is about. And a friend of mine called this The Audit. And it's the post-Me Too thing where literally everyone was suddenly going back over their whole life and thinking about all of their choices, all of their interpretations, sometimes seeing them in new ways, sometimes in painful ways. And the Confessions is different because it's a little bit of an intellectual version of this, but it's, you know, I think it's one person's version of The Audit, and I think that everybody comes to their own conclusions on these things. And it's been interesting reading other critics because like Wesley Morris wrote a really amazing piece about his feelings about Cosby, and also another one about Michael Jackson. Tony Scott in the Times wrote about Woody Allen through a different light. And I think there have been a lot of these pieces where people essentially are taking stock of their younger selves' response to things, not just in terms of bad experiences, but in terms of the way they view the world, the way they view art.
Did you feel you changed over the course of that essay?
Well, I mean, everybody changed over the course. I changed over the course of writing the book. I mean, the essay changed because I had to, you know, it was a hard essay to write.
Yeah, did that process of crystallizing those thoughts affect you in terms of...
Probably, but I mean, I probably can't come to a conclusion about it. I mean, the one thing I will say is that it's an essay as long as the 4 essays that I was planning to write instead of it. And so I think it's the longest thing I've ever written, because the Ryan Murphy profile is like 12K, and I think this is 17K. I mean, I don't think it drags. I worked really hard on, you know, it's also a piece of writing, so I worked on the pacing of it. But I think it needed to be big because I'm trying to cover a lot of ground. It's not just about one thing. It was interesting to fact check elements of it, because I was actually writing about things like, for instance, when I was a teenager, I had a internship at a publishing company where I read a first version of Roman Polanski's memoir. And so I had to try to figure, I seem to have had a false memory of that as having originally been called I, Roman. So I actually called up the editor of the book to ask him, before it was published, because when it's published, it's called Roman. I bought it. It's over there. You know, I talk at length about how much I love Rosemary's Baby in this piece. But one of the things is when you think about your reading and thinking experiences when you're younger, it's hard to retrace them. So it was actually interesting thinking about, what was I reading as a teenager? What was I reading as in college? What were my thoughts about it? So anyway, I fact checking that, and I had a wonderful fact checker on the piece, but figuring out that it was actually, because I remembered it as being called I, Roman, which I really thought was such a either funny or ridiculously egotistical thing to call your memoir. But I called up the editor and he was like, no, I think it was always called Roman. So I might have just misremembered that. But I think, you know, we embellish them. It's the nice thing about being a middle-aged person is you have like this strange, foggy...
TV rots your brain, kid.
That's probably it. That's probably the case.
The
boob tube.
Yeah. Critical influences?
I am not a person who grew up wanting to write arts criticism. So I admire Pauline Kael, for instance, tremendously. And sometimes people compare my stuff to her because we are both female critics who praise a lot of pop stuff, who work at the New Yorker and have a somewhat personal voice. And I get that. But although I think I read her when I was younger, because I did read the New Yorker, mostly the cartoons. But, when I was growing up at my parents' place, I was not a cinephile. So my background is not film criticism. So those are not my influences. Sometimes I was trying to name the people that were a big influence on me, and some of them are just stylists. Like, I loved Grace Paley, and obviously she's not a critic, but I reread her stuff multiple times. I loved Mary Gateskill when I read Bad Behavior in college. And some of it was just about the use of language in people. I loved Nora Ephron also, and I had read all of her collections. Excuse the
Fast and the Furious going on outside.
Motorcycle going by. Let's see. There were people that were just sort of heroic figures to me, like Linda Barry and Matt Groening, and I really liked a lot of Alison Bechdel. But they weren't influences on me. Like, they're not writing arts criticism. They're graphic novelists and comics and confessionalists. I'm very shaped by comedy. I was a big comedy nerd as a teenager. But in terms of my criticism, as I said, the truth is, a lot of the influences in my voice were even anonymous people online. It's not that I think I'm writing exactly like people on discussion boards, but there's a certain kind of verve and pugnaciousness to that language that I find refreshing, and I have a taste for criticism as a kind of theater rather than a sort of grounded
for the ages
voice from on high that's kind of an objective, calm voice. But, as with any writing, it's all about shaping it so that it is in between, so that it has a lasting value, but it also feels conversational. So those are the people that I'd name. But, I'm sure I could name a million people. And Woody Allen was one of them, honestly. I'm interested in people who can write comedically but also intelligently. Like, that is to me a big thrill. But I will say the older I get, the more I wonder, and I talk about this a little bit in Confessions, whether that's a little bit of a crutch, because there's a way in which being funny about something can actually be an easy out, like rather than actually taking the pause, taking it seriously. So it's been interesting this year. I found myself writing more things like The Tale, where I'm like, I can't use a joke to get out of the story that I'm talking about.
I'm not asking as a joke. I just realized Tale, T-A-I-L or T-A-L-E?
T-A-L-E, but I do think that it's meant a little bit as a dirty pun.
Yeah.
I mean, not that explicitly, but you should see it. It's good. It's by, I'm just blanking on her name suddenly. Jennifer is, I think, her first name. She'd made a very good personal documentary that aired on TV, which is how I knew her stuff. It was called Flying Confessions of a Single Woman. And she interviewed women all over the world about their choices and their singleness. And she also did sort of a personal documentary, confessional documentary about her own incredibly messy love triangle with some married guys, this whole thing. And she was a sort of globe-trotting documentary maker. And it's weird because I'd seen that, so I always had her name in my head. And then she made this movie, The Tale, and it's a movie. It's not a TV show, but it aired on HBO. So both of her things have been movie-like confessional pieces, but The Tale's incredibly different because it's aesthetically different, and it's genuinely about this question about what do we think about things from the past when we see them with new eyes. Mm-hmm. And honestly, that's the weird thing about putting together an anthology anyway.
Yeah. And that was my first question. Just like, how is it looking back? Weird. How do you decide what fit the themes and what isn't an embarrassment to you as a piece of writing? Yeah.
Definitely. Well, one of the nice things is you can actually exclude the things that you think are truly embarrassing, and there definitely are pieces. Although, it's weird because, of course, your opinion of your own... Like, I was saying to someone else in some discussion the other day, I was like, the important thing is, like, how do you be self-hating enough to improve the thing, but not so much that you cripple yourself and can't do anything? And, it's weird. I actually feel like I came to terms with the writing in the book more through doing the audiobook than through putting the book together. Because when I did the audiobook, reading it out loud actually confirmed to me the moments of criticism that I have of the book, like things where I felt like the writing didn't quite, like, reach the point that I wanted it to in terms of sophistication or voice or whatever. And yet, when I read other pieces that I really like and I'm proud of and felt like they held up, it was very satisfying. So I also felt like doing the audiobook oddly uploaded the book into my head in a way that editing the book had not, because it's too big.
Do you read your writing?
Yeah, I do. I mean, well, for one thing, when I write columns, I almost memorize them, because by the time I get to the final edit, I try to do that like Mind Palace thing where you have it in your head enough that you can see where the soft spots are. I almost always get the best fixes in the absolute final round. And I wish I were more like a first draft writer who hits it right away and then smooths everything around that. But I'm not like that. I'm a 3-draft writer. So, but you know, there are pieces that I had reread because the Sex and the City piece is popular. So I'd actually read it more than once, kind of thinking, because I say this in the book, but it's a little bit of a Trojan horse piece about some ideas I have. But it's not like I go back and reread my work a ton, but there are pieces in this that I knew fairly well. But then there were pieces that I hadn't reread and I was pleased when I went back. Like I remembered liking the Hannibal piece, for instance, and I went back and reread it. And this sounds cocky, but I was like, I reread it and I was like, this is really good. Yeah. I was actually very happy. I was like, I pulled it off because, you know, there are certain subjects that are hard to write about and to find the right tone. And when I got it, there is this incredible feeling of gratification. And when I didn't get it, which is the case, honestly, with some shows that I love, like there are pieces that I wrote that are like raves for shows that I admire that didn't go in the book because either the piece felt overridden, not that the piece was bad, but that it was trying to convince people to watch the show before the show was big. And so that tone of mild neediness or something just didn't read well to me as part of the
sort of a rah-rah.
Yeah. Well,
not in a bad way, but you're trying to champion
in a bad
things
way.
you like.
The desire to champion something reads differently during the first few episodes of the show than 4 years after the show has ended. And, you know, I also wanted to have a mix. You know, there's a mix of negative reviews, positive reviews. It's all sorts of things. But it was weird. Like, for instance, I actually love the show Transparent, which has gotten a lot of criticism in the years past. And obviously Jeffrey Tambor was mixed up in this whole thing, and they're putting out a new thing without Jeffrey Tambor. But even leaving that aside, the show, like the politics of trans portrayals have changed so much that the show is in this fraught category. I think that show is a great show. Like, I think that's a really powerful show. But it was weird that when I looked back at my 2 reviews of it, I was like, they just don't quite fit. And I felt like they either repeated themes or they didn't fully hold up or something. So anyway, that ended up being excluded from the book. And look, I like Transparent a great deal more than I like Jessica Jones, but Jessica Jones is a better column. So,
what you're trying to achieve in the book. Yeah. Do you feel, well, we talk about audience being the nature of what the shows themselves are. Your own audience, is it still the discussion board? No, reader?
I mean, first of all, my audience is a New Yorker audience.
I know, but
I've said this before, but I have this weird masochistic thing where, well, one thing that's just realistic is I have a sense that half my audience is really into TV and knows a lot and about it and is passionate about it, and half my audience doesn't even own a TV, doesn't watch any TV. I find that a fruitful creative challenge because I am trying to write for both audiences, and sometimes they come in conflict. Sometimes I want to write something that's real deep in granular. I want to make references.
Very familiar with the TV.
Yeah.
thing.
And sometimes my editor, I've actually had arguments with my editor where he's like, well, people won't get that reference. And I was like, why would they get this reference? And that, you know, sometimes we differ in what we think are overly deep cuts. For some reason, I remember there was this one time that I was trying to make, it was this enormous list of kind of cool butch women on TV that included Joe from Facts of Life. And like, it was this, I thought it was kind of a great cascading sentence. And he was like, this is like 5 people nobody's ever heard of. And it was like, so there's that. But I will say, I've said this before, and I think this is somewhat true, but not completely true. But sometimes I've perceived my audience as this very skeptical older guy who is a recently retired CEO of some company who has this minimalist apartment, doesn't own a TV, and thinks of himself as kind of fancy, and happens to be reading the New Yorker, sort of a fancy magazine, and reads this thing, and I'm writing about a show that he would never think to watch. And if I can make some kind of like glimmer of connection, that's a satisfied. So sometimes I think of my audience as literally the most hostile audience imaginable. And then that's the goal, is to speak to them. Because honestly, it's a lot easier to speak to people who already share your values. And you do want to write in a way that either, bullies, seduces, convinces, like finagles a person into listening to an idea that they're otherwise resistant to. You can't do that too much, because then everything you write ends up being, like
she's at it again.
Vaudeville aggression. So it varies. But I think that there is something in the nature of criticism in particular where I find it to be, it has a quality of evangelism or argumentation in my concept of it that's a little bit different than just writing an essay about a subject. Like, I do think of it as having an audience rather than just like I'm writing it for myself.
Yeah, that's what I wondered, and how that's evolved from, again, internet days to New York Magazine, Slate, et cetera.
Honestly, I'm curious to talk to a critic who actually thinks of themselves as not just writing for the ages, but just like, I'm just writing down my ideas in the best way that I can think. I have a concept of an ideal essay. Here it is. Because I genuinely do think of myself as speaking to someone. Like, I think there's a conversational tone to my criticism, but I think that's true with a lot of critics. Yeah. And maybe it's more true with TV critics, I'm not sure. But I just feel like if it was just me writing down my thoughts on the thing, they would not take this form.
Yeah.
This form is communication. That's what journalism is.
Now, when we connected first on Twitter to end up setting this up, it was in relation to you seeing the book in a bookstore for the first time. Yeah, and the great feeling you had. So, not that we want to rank everything.
Note facial expression of excitement.
Yes, you were ding, ding, ding.
Yeah.
Not that we want a list or a ranking, but is that more exciting than the Pulitzer announcement?
You know I'm bad at I'm not going to rank things. Well, first of all, the Pulitzer announcement, and I say this with all recognition that this is the most privileged thing that a person could possibly experience. I didn't know that I was up for the Pulitzer, so it was a total surprise. Yeah. David Remnick called me and he said, I want to let you know you won the Pulitzer for this. And I was like, what? So it wasn't as though I was up for a prize and then won it. It was like the prize wasn't, first of all, historically the prize had not been given. They changed the rules. Like, it wasn't given to magazine people. It was only a newspaper prize. So I didn't even know it was available to me.
That you were eligible. Yeah.
Right. I didn't know I was eligible. So they submitted me, but I didn't know they submitted me. So that was pure gravy. Like, there's no downside to winning a Pulitzer for the work you do other than increased expectations and the fact that when you later fail and fall short, people will say, that person won a Pulitzer? And that's true. That's the negative part. But I mean, honestly, what am I going to complain about that? It's fine. So that was very good. Seeing the book in a bookstore was very exciting. And this is going to sound terrible, but it's true. I spent months before the book came out feeling enormous dread and self-loathing and kind of wishing the book wouldn't come out. I wasn't like excited to have a book out. I'd never published a book, and I felt anxious about it because I felt like it's a different kind of writing. Maybe if I write other books, I'll feel differently about publishing books. But I just had this feeling of like, it's so weird. Like, does it work? Does the argument come across? And then I'm the type of person who like obsesses about little things. And I was like, there's this phrase in the opening chapter and it seems like I could. Yeah. So I definitely went through different stages of self-doubt and self-loathing, which again, I mean, honestly, I don't find that unusual. There might be other people who didn't feel this way. But then I have to say, first of all, the book's gotten a nice reception, which is great. And people are enjoying it. It's exciting to have people read it. And I felt much better about it once I did the audiobook. Then I was like, I know what I'm publishing. Seeing it in the bookstore was actually, I don't know. I felt it was very uncomplicated, like, yay. Yeah. It's also, I have a bunch of friends that have published books and it's a different process in a different industry. And it just felt more real. Also, it's my local bookstore, which I love. Mm-hmm. So I was excited. And my husband has written 2 books and I don't know, there was something great about us having our books in the bookstore. Publishing is a weird industry though, because it's just, magazine publishing is very picayune and specific and detail-oriented, but people think of it as very ephemeral. And publishing is just something I had to get used to in terms of I didn't understand the schedule. I didn't understand how editing worked. I didn't understand, like I hired outside fact checkers because there isn't fact checking for it. Like it's a learning curve about the whole thing.
And you're coming from the New Yorker.
I'm very grateful. Random House has been great and I'm happy. And also, look at the cover. The cover's so good.
Oh, yeah.
Like they did a great job. So I'm excited about that because it makes it look fun and like candy instead of like, here's a bunch of essays.
Which, in fact, I was going to say, you've turned me on to finally starting Jane the Virgin.
Oh, yes.
Which we would always see, I guess, the very beginning of after Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. It was, we should watch. Oh, my God, there's 25 episodes a season, and it would just go on and on.
It's so weird. It's the old model of TV where there's all these episodes. Yeah.
So we'll have to carve out Frasier time and start Jane the Virgin.
Well, Jane the Virgin's a show I watch with my kids, and it's about to end. And I'm very curious to see how they land the ending. I think it's a wonderful show. It's interesting because I think a lot of people who watched both Crazy Ex-Girlfriend and Jane liked Jane, but they held it sort of second best because Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, as chaotic as it could be, was about dark material. I mean, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend is about somebody who's mentally ill and very destructive, and it has this grand, dark reach. I love Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. It's really one of my favorite shows of the last few years. Jane the Virgin is a very lovely, sweet, humane show about a family. So I think there was sometimes a tendency for people to take it for granted a little bit, just because the two were next to each other.
Even, yeah, it's a brighter palette, etc.
And I actually even slightly understand that because it's about like healthy and loving relationships. It's also set in the world of a telenovela. It is a telenovela. It's a meta telenovela, and so it has these very extreme, outrageous plot turns, but they're treated realistically. But I really think it's an incredibly smart and beautiful show. And it's been a great couple of seasons. I'm sad that it's ending, but I'm also glad that they got to end it where they wanted it to, because I wouldn't want to see it like drizzle out for extra seasons. But it's been fun to watch it with my kids because, like a lot of the best television shows, it's a meta show that is self-conscious about storytelling. And I'm not saying every show that's great is like this, because that's not true. But there's a certain type of show that is TV about TV in the way that this show is, that is particularly fun for me to talk about with the kids in some ways, because they really notice these little self-referential things in the narrator, the way they use visuals. It's great. It's lovely.
You mentioned the finale thing. We're reading, I guess it was during the build-up to the end of Game of Thrones, another show that I never watched, about whether finales matter. I can't remember if it was Zoller Seitz or someone else who'd done that. Finales matter?
I mean, I think I say this in the book, finales matter too much. Yeah. I mean, the problem is they do matter and they don't. Like,
I guess it's a question, once again, of the art versus the audience.
I mean, there was a weird quality to the Lost finale where people were like, how can you say that a finale ruined a show? Like, that seems crazy. But Lost was a puzzle story, so it actually did matter, the resolution they came to. I don't feel like the last 2 terrible seasons of Dexter ruined the first 4 excellent seasons of Dexter. Or even that the weaker 3rd season of Dexter, which was ambitious but didn't succeed, ruined the other parts of it. Like, the weird thing about a TV show is that it has a kind of wave and particle quality where it's like, is the episode good? Is the season good? Is the show good? Yeah. Is the story arc good? Like, all of those things can sort of be taken both together and separately. And the finale is meaningful, but I definitely think that some shows that I love have had not great finales. Like, I was not a big fan of the Parks and Recreation finale. There's a certain kind of finale that has a lot of closure and fan service that satisfies people when they watch it, because it's meant as sort of a soothing device for the audience who's grieving the end of the show. But I am not that impressed by as art, because my bias is I want things to be more ambitious than that. But I have weird taste. Like, I like some finales. I liked the Seinfeld finale, for instance. I liked it at the time. I still like it.
Maybe I'll watch that, and it'll be the only one I ever see.
That would be very weird. It's a very strange finale to watch.
That's what I've heard, but yeah.
I'm like, so it's like they matter and they don't matter. I do think it mattered with Game of Thrones, because Game of Thrones, while a drama, was also in some ways a reality show. Like, it was,
please.
It was about a bunch of people competing for a prize. And so what happens to the prize actually matters in the context of the show. I have mixed feelings about Game of Thrones. It's not my favorite show, but it's definitely interesting. And I understand why people were watching it and excited about it. But man, the pressure of that finale was getting in my head. I can only imagine how the showrunners felt. It depends on the show. I mean, I wrote a whole piece about Sex and the City that says that I feel like the finale failed to, it sort of chickened out on some of the themes of the show. But did it ruin the show? No. And actually, the finale's not bad in its way. It's just, I like things that push back at the audience or pivot in some interesting way, which is why I like the finale of The Sopranos.
I was going to say, everything goes back to The Sopranos finish, because...
Apparently I like sourpuss finales.
Well,
I just don't like to be pandered to.
No one will ever forget that ending.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. And it's not that I want finales to all be angering or something. Yeah. It's just that I don't like for finales to pander to the audience and to be like the expression of the way in which writers for a show can also be fans of their own characters and want the characters to be happy. Like, that is to me not satisfying. What can I say? I want shows to operate as art, which is to say I want the stories to feel real in a certain way. Not that the story is literally, like this can apply to experimental shows as well. But so, yes. And Breaking Bad, I am obsessed with the fact that I feel like that was a beloved finale. Many people love that finale. I felt like that finale was, in fact, very well made, but super corny fan service that actually betrayed the central themes of the show. And
it should have ended while he's sitting there waiting for the pickup at the end of Ozymandias. That's the end of this.
Yeah, I think the end of Ozymandias. And I think the people making the show kind of really did try to have it several ways. They actually have talked about the fact that each of the last 3 or 4 episodes is its own kind of ending. That is not satisfying to me, because I'm like, it becomes an incoherent narrative. Yeah. But it's still a very interesting text, so I will say that. It's not boring, and I would like to revisit it at some point. And it's a show that I've changed my mind about in a slightly negative direction with over time, but it's still something that I experienced as a very beautiful experience while watching it. I mean, I love the show. So in that case, I do think that the finale matters, but I wouldn't say that's true for every show.
Writing profiles of people you end up reviewing, or writing profiles of people you've already reviewed, uncomfortable at times?
I think it's an ethically dicey dynamic. Yeah. It's not uncommon. I didn't write any profiles for the first few years I was at the New Yorker, and part of the reason I was happy to have the job is that it felt so clean, because I was just writing criticism. So the tension between those two things, coverage of stuff and criticism, which is something I had at New York, I no longer had for the first few years. But I'm nosy. I like reporting. There's something a little airless about only writing criticism. I actually feel like it's meaningful for me to know how TV is made, because it informs what I'm saying about TV. But also, what I've done is I've chosen people to profile where I already had essential respect for their work. I would not profile somebody whose art I didn't think was important. That doesn't mean I like every single thing they've made. It means I think they are an important television creator. So that's always the starting point of these profiles. But so the 3 people who are in this book are Kenya Barris, who created Blackish, Genji Kohan, who created Orange is the New Black and Weeds and some other shows, and Ryan Murphy, who's created like 35 billion shows. Somebody asked me what they have in common, and I was like, they have in common Norman Lear. Like they're all like, I mean, not that Norman Lear is each of their biggest influences, although I would say in the case of Kenya and Ryan Murphy, that is actually somewhat true. But they all are TV makers who are very in TV, rather than, filmmakers who came. They have stuff in common, and they have a certain kind of like willingness to offend and to be loud and brassy, but they have also very different kinds of shows. I mean, they make them in different ways. They're very different people. So that's the part of it where I felt like my being a TV critic is actually useful in those profiles, because I'm not really just writing about them as people. I'm writing about the way that their lives and their personalities inflect the kind of art they made. But look, anyone who's written a profile, it's a very different experience. Like, it's a, they're professionals, they're grown-ups, and I'm not like stalking them. Yeah. They agreed to do a profile and we're doing it, but it's like a complicated interpersonal experience.
The one with Murphy in particular.
Yes.
There's the thing that occurs near the end that's very, with the letter.
You mean about the letter?
Yeah. I was describing it to my wife. She's like, Really? That's dicey territory to
it is
for Ryan Murphy to have put you in.
But I put him in it. Like I had him saying what he was doing, so it was clear that although Ryan is honestly one of the most powerful people that I've ever met, for a variety of different reasons, that I wanted to make it clear to the reader that he understood what he was sharing, and that I was not. I mean, there's an extent to which we were both manipulating one another, because any conversation of this type has a manipulative quality, but that he was clear about his choice about this. But I also asked him to share this very personal letter from his father. But, Ryan believes that, I think correctly, that the way in which his growing up as this extremely flamboyant, driven, wild little boy with these very particular artistic tastes who wanted to be the Pope, and the struggle that he had with his father that was very painful, and his father was very abusive to him, and they had this very charged relationship. That is not a side issue to his art. His art is in many ways, it's not solely a response to that, but that's a lot of, it's reflected in it. Yeah. And also he believes correctly that it's meaningful to tell these stories because other people have experienced things like this, and they appear in different versions in his piece. It's not that his work is memoir. It's not. I mean, he has very broad, complex, bold ideas, both about everything involving television. And, he's not just a writer, like he's a real producer, and there's a part of him that's like a master showman. But this vulnerable thing with his father is definitely a part of it. But yeah, the situation in which somebody reads you something that private is something that's very precious and complicated and charged. I'm grateful to him for trusting me in that. But of course, my job as a writer is not to write the piece for Ryan. It's to write the piece for a broader truth to it. So I personally think that he is an incredibly admirable figure. He's also a very complicated person, and he himself knows and acknowledges that. That's, to me, part of what makes him admirable. Like, he talked to me about those kinds of things. But at a certain point, he is a person. I met him. I did the reporting. I wrote the piece, and then other people can judge. They can read the piece, figure out whether they like the piece, what they think about Ryan, what they think about his art, and then that's, out of my hands. But I'm proud of that piece. And when I read it out loud, I actually felt good about it. So that made me happy, because it's very sensitive material.
In that Sophie's Choice sort of way, piece you're proudest of? And then which child would you kill? I'm just kidding.
Yeah, there's probably, I have several. I'm very Medea-like with my work. I mean, it seems braggy to talk about, but, there are pieces. Something? I think the Joan Rivers piece is the piece that I like the best in the book, because it's a piece about a conflicted relationship with a public figure, but I feel like it
and the ways
feminism
has changed. It carries a lot.
It's about the way that her self-loathing was both the origins of her genius and the harmful thing about her. I mean, it's not just a pure celebration of her, but it's not a put down either. I'm involved in the piece. I like that piece. So, but the Sex and the City piece is the piece that readers have liked the most. And so I feel happy about that, because it's enabled a certain kind of fan of Sex and the City to stop apologizing for liking what's actually a very good, ambitious, and interesting show.
The same thing you say about Jane the Virgin, that it's not guilty pleasure. Yeah. You throw that out. Yeah. You can enjoy something without having to make excuses for it. So.
That's exactly it. Sometimes people misunderstand that. I was talking to someone the other day where they were like, that's right, I like this super dumb, and I don't think reality TV is dumb per se, but they were saying, I like this idiot reality show and I watch it and it turns off my brain. And I'm like, that's fine. I don't actually have any objection to that. I have a piece about Vanderpump Rules in the book. But that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the misuse of the phrase guilty pleasure. Yes, I have no problem with people experiencing pleasure, but the piece, Sex and the City and Jane the Virgin, are not dumb shows that are fun to watch. Those are smart shows that are fun to watch. So I feel like sometimes people misunderstand this and feel like I'm saying, it's a free-for-all, watch terrible garbage, and I'm like, no, I think some things are bad and some things are good. That's what all critics think. So, but I'm talking about a kind of piece, a kind of show, often a feminized show or a comedy show or a stylized show or a genre show or a show that's seen as juvenile or teenage, that gets put down for those qualities when those qualities are not definitionally bad. And that's what I'm trying to defend. Not like the like a dumb fun show, but a show that has been falsely smeared for being associated with things that people incorrectly assume make it junky.
It's like when I read Brett Martin's book when we were doing our podcast. The men get hour-long shows, the women get half hours.
Although that's no longer true.
Yeah. What are the female hour-long?
First of all, Jane the Virgin and Crazy Ex-Girlfriend are both hour-long shows. And The Americans, which is part of the Antihero Pantheon, is a show about a man and a woman that is also an hour-long show. Although I will say, it's funny, somebody, a TV writer, just tweeted recently saying that half hours are where all the ambition is in TV lately. And I was like, I wrote counterpoint Succession, because Succession is an excellent hour-long show on HBO that I love, that was this year. But I saw her point, because it's true that a lot of the strangest and most interesting things have happened in half hours. Some of them ones that probably nobody's watching, like Lady Dynamite, Maria Bamford's show, which was just amazing, or The Comeback, which was great. But because I think people have been trained to think of half hours as synonymous with sitcom, and sitcom has it has a class valence as something disposable. I love sitcoms, but it's a way that people put down half hours. On the other hand, look, people want to watch half-hour shows because they take less time.
That was how we got through 200 and something episodes of Frasier, because we could say, it's 22 minutes. We'll keep going. And
Frasier really is such a funny show.
It was amazing.
It's also like a fascinating show. Like, this is just a behind-the-scenes element of it, but it's like this gay straight show in such an interesting way, because literally, like, every single person on that show, other than Kelsey Grammer, is a gay actor who wasn't necessarily out when the show was on, but it also is this arch show about men who have this atypical masculinity. So it's almost this. It's not like it's like not like the conscious subject of it, but it's like the guy who plays Bulldog was an openly gay actor who's doing a lot of activism, and it sort of. It has a quality that plays. I'm not saying it's all that the show's about. But
it's an interesting subtext. But
it's an interesting aspect of it, and it actually reminds me of. One of the things I love in Ryan Murphy's shows is he sometimes casts gay actors that are gay in roles that have to do with homophobic oppression, and it lends the scenes this weird doubleness. So he has Sarah Paulson and Zach Quinto performing this terrible scene of like a doctor tormenting a lesbian patient, but because they're both gay and they're open and able to be open now, like it adds something. So it's different with Frasier because some of the people were out and some of the people weren't, but it definitely has this sort of like witty archness that, given that it's a show that's ostensibly about a single straight man and his straight brother who's yearning for a woman, it also has this very funny gay quality.
And his butch dad who's...
Yes.
Last question, I promise. Favorite Crazy Ex-Girlfriend song?
I think my favorite one... The thing is, it'd be so hard to pick because on different days I'd pick different songs. The two songs that are my favorites, one of them is the sort of obvious one, which is You Ruined Everything, You Stupid Bitch.
I never liked that one, but I don't have the big show-stopping Broadway thing.
I play it when I'm having trouble writing. I find it incredibly... I'm not the only one who feels this way. It's an incredibly... And also, I have to say, I do think it's a distinctly female song, not just because it's sung by a woman and she's calling herself a bitch, but there's something about... the nature of the diva self-loathing in the song doubling as this kind of affirmation where she's saying, this, sing along with me. Like, I think it's an amazing performance, and there's something really poignant and dark and powerful about it, the way that it doubles as a put down and a statement of existence and pointing out that this kind of psychological state exists. It's beautiful. So I love that song. It's a popular song. I also... being a 90s person or the 80s person or whatever, I could if I wanted to. The song, I love a lot of songs by, why am I blanking on his name suddenly? Her...
Santino Fontana?
Yeah, Santino Fontana. What's his character's name? Greg. Yeah. I like so many of Greg's songs. Like,
settle for me.
I'm crazy for Greg's songs. Like, I love I gave you a UTI. It's a really good song. It is. Like, he has a lot of good songs. But I could if I wanted to. And the video for that, where he's going down the street just mocking people and being self-destructive. You know something? I apparently like both songs about self-loathing.
Go figure.
That's I like two songs that are, one of them is actually a diva, beautiful self-expression of self-loathing. The other one is just a satire of a certain kind of like indie 90s guy, sort of like I'm too smart to try. So those are my two favorites. Although Jap Rap Battle is also, as a, I don't know if I'm hard as nails, Shebrew from Scarsdale.
Yeah, you're
like close enough.
Again, for my wife, it's Where's the Bathroom? The Tova Feld show when she shows up at the
brilliant song.
Now, your review of Crazy Ex-Girlfriend is what got me to start watching it. It happened to be the episode after that with the Party Bus, which was a lower episode, but we thought we'll give it a shot.
It has its moments.
And then we caught up with the first season after it ended, and
Party Bus is a hard one to watch without having watched the rest of the show, because it's all about her pre-existing self-destructive relationship.
Yeah, we weren't sure what we were in for, and thought
we'll
keep watching a couple more weeks, see what happens. And then we caught the earlier ones with the culmination of Where's the Bathroom, and thought, okay, let's just keep this rolling. And
that is incredible. And also Tova Felcha. So good. But, the thing is about Crazy Ex-Girlfriend is that's a great show that is not a perfect show. Like, there are definitely soft episodes. The last season, I thought the first few episodes had trouble figuring out their pacing, but it doesn't matter, because sometimes a show is so original and interesting that the flaws in it are just part of making it, and it's fine with me. I mean, I just think it's a nice thing about TV that's made over time is that sometimes things that are original and challenging and do new things, especially, oh my God, they were putting like 2 new musical songs in an episode per week. Yeah. It's a very high standard to meet, and a shocking amount of those songs are good. It's a remarkable achievement. So I'm a person who, it's nice for something to be perfect, but it's better for something to be powerful, interesting, and original. So I feel like the flaws are worth it in a show like that. But I'm glad that you watched it from the review. That's nice.
Again, you seduced somebody. That was
Yay.
Emily, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It was really nice.
And that was Emily Nussbaum. Her new book is I Like to Watch, Arguing My Way Through the TV Revolution, from Penguin Random House. And it's at bookstores every damn where, so pick it up. I loved it, and like I said, I'd barely seen any of the shows she reviewed, but her writing is so good, and the essays and the profiles are also fantastic. The whole book is just a marvel. So check it out, and hit Emily's website, which is emilynussbaum.com, which you spell EMILYNUSSBAUM.com. She's on Twitter and Instagram as Emily Nussbaum, all one word. So you should follow her there too. She's got pretty good online personality, as you can tell. Now, after we wrapped, I asked Emily, so who you been reading? If you want to hear her answer to that and get some extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. I'll get started on the Q2 episode soon, but the first quarter 2019 one features book recommendations and some extra conversation with Jerome Charan, Peter Cooper, Edmund White, Eva Hagberg, Mort Gerberg, James Osland, Joe Chardello, James Sturm, Martin Haglund, Bram Presser, and Nathan Englander. You can support the Virtual Memories show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, the patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, and my secret project, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. I recorded this one at Emily's home in Brooklyn, which meant a toll at the George Washington and another one at the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel on the way back. But I found street parking near her place, so that was it for cash expenses, besides, gas, time, and a croissant at the amazing French bakery near her place. If you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee and croissant, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Buzz Carter, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Lescamella, Teresa Lewis, Stephen Nadler, Barbara Nessim, Jim Ottaviani, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. Especially Barbara, who went way over and above. Thank you very much. We've got the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Now, our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018, recorded just about this time last year, and listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. That's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thank you so much for listening. Not sure if there's going to be an episode next week, since, as I mentioned at the top, I'll be at ReaderCon and I don't have an episode in the can. But if I have time to do the editing, etc., it'll probably be with the author and teacher Kate Maruyama. Otherwise, come back a week later, then you'll get the one with Kate. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, keep watching TV, and keep the conversation going.